I write it. I'm going to show everyone a cover of your book, Love and Time, An Ethical Inquiry, which came out from UChicago Press recently. So, just to start, I want to kind of have you introduce us to the how you came about this project overall. Maybe to discussing, in the very beginning of your book, you talk about how your own relationship with this book has been a process over time, of course. And so, also to say that love is a topic that has been important for both philosophy and religious ethics. And you bring these two fields together in this book. So, how did you come to this project and how did this book come about?
Thanks. Well, thank you, Isabelle, so much for having me, and to the philosopher, Remy, and the whole team. I'm really grateful and honored to be with you. And thanks for that question. So this book came about, it did indeed take quite a lot of time, and the jokes sort of wrote themselves as I was working on it. But the book really emerged out of sort of the reasons that I came to study religion in the first place, which was that I was interested in questions like justice and, worried about how the world works and all of those sort of basic ethical questions that bring people to philosophy and politics. And got really interested in the way that religions, and especially Christianity, which is not my own religion or my own tradition, thinks about these big ideas in terms of the necessity of love coming in to supplement forms of worldly justice and worldly rights and other discourses of that kind. I'm describing a process that started when I was maybe like 17 years old and starting university, but that really came to fruition in this book because it's very much about what love is doing that we can't do with some of the more ordinary tools of especially political and ethical thought. I think of those ordinary tools as things like justice, and also forms of definition and definitional certainty. And love kind of comes in to disrupt that in our lives. And I'm trying to argue in the book also in our inquiries. So the emphasis on uncertainty in the book, to sort of falsely derive it, I think was what first drew me to thinking about religion and thinking about love. Was that there was sort of room for excess that I wasn't finding in other parts of philosophy, but that could come together also with a sort of substantial tradition behind it, or various traditions behind it.
Mhm. Maybe just to have you linger there for a moment, I'm thinking about the beginning of your book where you describe how this definitional project of the task of defining love, and maybe distinguishing between its quote unquote kind of true forms versus its semblances, like the and its yeah, which maybe is tied to something kind of like the good versions of love versus the kind of bad or pathological versions of love, right? Is something that both philosophers and religious ethicists have also spent a lot of time thinking about. And at the beginning of the book, you kind of part of the way you frame the project is to say, well, that's not your primary concern. You do offer a definition of love, so maybe you can share that. I'm sure we'll come back to it later in our discussion. But do you also want to say just a little bit more about what the kind of limits are of that of trying to kind of pin down like a definition of what love really is?
Yeah, sure. So early on in the book, I say something along the lines of, I'm talking, love could mean lots of different things, and lots of people are interested in or worried about kind of policing or describing different kinds of love. And I think that that's a really important activity. Like, there are some really good books about that. There are a lot of good reasons to want to differentiate between romantic love and familial love and divine love and things like that. We can come up with those ourselves, or I can talk about them more in the Q&A. But I'm interested in love really as an experience that I feel as the lover. So this book also isn't really about so much the experience of being loved, but about what it feels like to love. And in that sense, what it feels like to love almost anything. One of the things that I think that can feel like is wanting to get it right, wanting other people to do it right, wanting to do it right yourself. And so that might rely on some kind of definition of what it means to get stuff right. But the aspect of love that I'm most interested in is the experience of not knowing how to get it right or not knowing what's going to happen next. So this is really a book about desire, and the feeling of desire, the feeling of love, the feeling of want. And the definition that I end up giving of love, which is a very bare definition, it's sort of not, in some ways I try to say like, this cannot possibly be the whole story, but that's part of the argument, is that love in part is the want to spend more time with the beloved. And so the aspect of love that I think unites most of what we call love in English, and in fact many things that we don't quite call love, but sort of fit into this category in various senses, is that we want some future with that beloved. I talk about it as more time and not a future primarily because I don't want to posit a kind of like future that I'm aiming for specifically. It could just be the more time in the sense of like I want to see you for 5 more minutes. That kind of desire, as well as something like an imaginary of what my future with somebody could be like. And there are a lot of caveats about how wanting more time doesn't mean I want to spend a lot of time with everyone I love, or even just
interminable time. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I really do think that you love your family members you would love not to see sometimes, so long as you want some kind of future, some kind of more time with them, even if it isn't right now.
I'm thinking both about, yes, our present situation being snowed in for many folks, and also COVID was also a time where that I think that, yeah, those thoughts were brought to the fore.
Yeah.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about love, and I also want to linger now on the other part of your title, so the in time part of love and time. And this is kind of a tripartite question, so we'll take it slow, and we can circle back. I can say again what what the three parts are. But so one question is just like, what does paying attention to time or love and time teach us about love? Why is it that you've chosen to focus on that time or the temporal aspect? Another way of putting the question is like, what vision of love does temporality give or afford us? And then the other question is, I was starting to think about like the way that we use the phrase in time in other senses. So one would be is a way of describing time's limits or our own limits. So I hope I make it in time. Like there's some I have somewhere to be, and there's a finite amount of time that I can take up to get there. I hope I make it in time. And then I was also thinking about the other way we use the phrase, which is kind of denoting that we're aligned or in accordance with a rhythm or tempo of like a musical piece, right? So if someone is dancing in time, they're like in accordance with this other thing that's happening musically, rhythmically, in terms of tempo. So one question is, which is kind of referring to this first bit about time's limits, how can we ethically deal with the pressures of time when it comes to love and life's rhythms? So I'm thinking of the kind of ordinary worry that a lot of people share about finding love in time, as in with enough time to get on with other projects that they care about, like building a family, or maybe just simply enjoying life with a partner before the difficulties of aging and ultimately dying, right? So will I find love in time? Or will I be able to love in time before, with enough time for all these other things I care about doing? And then the second way I'm thinking about this is like the rhythm part of in time. So what does it mean to love in time in accordance with life's rhythms or tempos, which I'm thinking of as things that we don't necessarily set ourselves, right? So both because life happens, right? So events occur that kind of shake up maybe the rhythm, the ordinary rhythm of our lives. And also because we come up against normative social expectations about how the rhythms of our lives should accord with time. So I'm thinking about the way that, it's not just the case that there are normative social expectations about what we should do with our lives, but also that those expectations come at particular moments in our time, right? So adolescence as a time for doing such and such thing, or young adulthood as a time for doing such and such thing. And so those are like the two kind of different kinds of pressure, I guess, that I'm thinking about for loving
Mhm.
in time. And I wonder, what do you think of them?
Yeah, I love these three ways of thinking about time. I think that the one of the things I'm most interested in thinking about love and time is how little control we have as we think toward the future. So part of what I'm trying to think about, or what I came to see, sort of convinced myself of, is that a crucial part of love is our vulnerability to what could happen next, and that includes both the vulnerability to not having our love returned, or having our loved ones suffer and die, or having our loved ones hurt us, and also having our own feelings about them change. So I'm really interested in the fact that, like, you can have all the best laid plans and in fact really love somebody and then fall out of love with them, and the plans that you made for that future can sometimes be very inconveniently disrupted. It's not like falling out of love with somebody is always something that you want. This is where I find Harry Frankfurt's second order care is really useful, to say, like, sometimes we don't love people and we wish we did, and sometimes we do love people and we wish we didn't. So that kind of internal form of disputation has a lot to do with the sense of vulnerability that we have. But all of that is really internal to the lover. And I think your question puts pressure on the thing that I don't have a good answer to, except to say that I think it's important that a definition of love doesn't somehow give you an answer to it. So
Mm-hmm.
in that way, I do have an answer to it, which is that this description of love as a form of desire, as a want to spend more time with the beloved, is a description of something that happens to me. It's not a description of something that I choose to do, importantly.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that it is resistant to the things that I might want in terms of how I order my life. And so the social pressures of wanting this to happen before I'm 25, and wanting this to happen before I'm 40, or of wishing I had met this person earlier because maybe we would have had a different kind of life together, or similarly wishing I could have not met somebody earlier and didn't end up with this life with them. Those kinds of regrets and fears for the future, I think, are just baked into being temporal beings. And the thing that I'm worried about is a definition of love that somehow endows those kinds of desires for my life to go a certain way, um, with the weight of what the right kind of love or the wrong kind of love is. And so, to say that maybe more clearly, I'm worried about a version of love that says you should have figured out how to do this already, or
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't be with somebody given that you can't have a whole life with them, or something like that. And I don't think those are views that people voice very often, but I think that they're views that are sometimes implicit in
Mm-hmm.
the ways that we think about wanting certain kinds of things. There are also views that are part of the way we condemn bad love. So the idea of, like, you're too young to do this, or you're too old to do this, or you shouldn't love somebody like that, or something along those lines. Those condemnations, I think, sometimes trade on things that might be fears and might cause forms of tragedy, but I don't think are coherently baked into a concept of love.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I should say this is not a sort of broadly accepting concept of love in terms of social norms. Like, I don't think that we should have no social norms about love. I think that we should worry about when we're saying that those are part of the definition of love, and when we're saying that those are part of the are part of our social practices around what are good ways to treat each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part of what I hear you saying too is that your account of love maybe is also a kind of uh guard against some of the concerns that I have around not even what we the second order desires, like what I desire, what I'll do by the time I'm 25 or 40, but also
Mhm.
what other people's expectations are of me, right? That like that part of my response could be like, well, Love happens in time, and so I don't have control over those your desires for my life, let alone my own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's um, you brought up briefly your idea around vulnerability, and I figure maybe now is a good time to talk a little bit more there. So, one idea that you return to over and over again is this idea that lovers actually desire the vulnerability that love brings. And I think this is an idea that some people might find surprising. And so, I want to give you a chance to kind of explain how you arrive at this conclusion, also tease out the what you mean by the desire and the vulnerability, that such that this might make sense to I mean, it does make sense, but that to explain to viewers here. And the other question I have around vulnerability, which is something that you also just mentioned, is that it seems like when vulnerability enters your analysis, it's primarily about the future and like what we can't control, right? Or the uncertainty of the future and the things that we can't control in time that are ahead of us. Um, so fears of the future, fears about changes in ourselves as lovers, or in our beloved, or in the circumstances around our love, rather than a vulnerability about past harm. And so I'm curious about like what's your relationship to thinking about vulnerability as past harm? Why should we, when we're thinking about love and time, kind of prioritize maybe thinking about vulnerability in the way that you often engage it, which is thinking about our kind of worries about the future?
Yeah, thanks. So, my next book project is more specifically about vulnerability in this way, and I'm in the middle of writing the chapter on Hobbes, and so I'll give sort of a very
Mm,
Hobbesian description of this. But I think that is how I came to think about it in the context of love. So many people talk about vulnerability in terms of the present state. So I am currently vulnerable. That is kind of literally what the word means. I am susceptible to wounding, which is a present state and not the future harm that I'm thinking about. Hobbes has this really interesting description of it, though, based on his materialism, or based sort of forming his materialism, really, that vulnerability the is something that we encounter as the imagination or memory, which for him are really two words for the same thing. That is the remnant, the decay our of our sensations. That we experience things and we remember them, which allows us to imagine them, and then we project that imagination into the future. And as we project that imagination in the future, I realize that those things can happen to me again.
mhm,
So I think that that's a pretty good understanding of vulnerability for a lot of purposes. And your question about that in love, especially if we're thinking about romantic love, um, I think is very often a discussion of how we live and learn, how we find our way maybe to a certain kind of cynicism over time, or maybe just to a sense that we have more experience, so we know how things are going to be. And I find it useful to remember that that is a product of our imagination as well as of our experience. So Hobbes's view that this is the projection of our experience as we can extrapolate it or as it decays in our mind, reminds us both that we are getting these ideas about the future from somewhere, and also that we are shouldn't be too confident in where we're getting them from, or in what they are actually. Maybe where we're getting them from we can be confident about. So that's a long path to saying, I think to the extent that vulnerability and love is important, one of the ways that it's important is in thinking about what kind of uncertainty we are encountering, and particularly remembering that we are uncertain about the future. So even if I've learned quite a lot, I don't actually know how this is going to go. And remembering that there is an important way of talking about what I do know about the future based on what I've experienced. To get back to where you started, the question of of what kind of desire for vulnerability I'm talking about in that understanding of love, a really important part of where I came to with this project was to say that if what the lover desires is is time with the other, that is about the other and not about themselves, then they can't want that time to be determined entirely by them. So to put it in the first person, if what I want is time with you, and it's really with you and not just like a project of my own making, then I can't want that time to go in only the ways that I've decided. I can't want control over that. And when I say I can't want it, I don't mean that we don't experience that want sometimes, or I'm not disappointed, but that if it's really a desire to spend time with you, or if it really is time of that kind, then I'm going to need to want a lack of control over that future. This is based on some thinking about the way that the beloved is at the core of that desire instead of my own understanding of the time itself. So all of that's to say, what I end up wanting is the time that I can't determine entirely by myself. I want time that is partly determined by you. And that means that I want that time not to be under my control. And were I to want otherwise, then what I would be wanting is just a thing that I made up. So, so to the extent that it's really about you as the beloved, and really about time as the uncertain future, and of course there are other ways of thinking about time, there are other ways of thinking about the beloved, but for these purposes, that's where I am. Then I can't want to know exactly what's going to happen. And so I'm interested in describing that as a desire for the uncertainty of that, because I want other people to be in control of how that time is determined. I think that is sort of counterintuitive to some people. And I have to say, maybe this is just my limitation in my imagination about these things, but I think sometimes it seems counterintuitive because what we want is a form of control. But sometimes it seems counterintuitive because it sounds like you would be wanting like a wild and crazy life, like that just goes in some other direction. But I don't mean. I really mean that I don't want it just to be a project of my own making. It may all go exactly as I hope it does, and I think for a lot of us, like we hope for that. I want a nice long life with the people I love, and I want them not to suffer, and I want them not to have certain kinds of challenges or difficulties, blah, blah, blah. I can paint you the whole picture. I want to go on this vacation, or I want to like pursue these hobbies and professions and activities. And in all of that, maybe my life goes exactly the way I wanted. But if I got there by diminishing the possibility of it happening otherwise, when the people I love were going to make it happen otherwise, if I like cut people out of my life because they don't fit with the picture that I want or something like that, or I force them to be a certain kind of way because that was my picture of what our life together was like, that's where I want to say, I think that's actually a breakdown of what love is, because it's no longer a desire for life with the other. It's a desire for a particular life where that person is kind of a character. And that's really where I'm starting. That gets to be the sort of definitional structure of love here, beyond the kind of like ongoing desire for that future. For those of you who wanted something a little more specific that I was getting to earlier, that's where the rubber meets the road, I think.
And so I think this is maybe a good segue to talk a little bit about how you address both like evaluating our beloveds and or the temptation to evaluate. Maybe in some sense the kind of like inescapability of on some level evaluating our loves, and in market values too, right? So and one way of posing the question specifically, and I recognize that this is like perhaps because of my own interests also, maybe a little bit too focused on like romantic love, but so we could think about alternatives in other sites of love. But in reading the analysis that you wrote around evaluating the beloved and market values and wanting to kind of resist market values, you engage in with other scholars who critique the kind of way that market values drive our lives, I couldn't help but wonder, like, so what would Fannie say about why in so many people search for love, for partners, and maybe also, like, I think sometimes this happens in friendships, but there's this practice of listing desirable traits, characteristics, and values, right? And I think that it's like, in some ways there are algorithms that have made it really easy to do this, to find people or kind of filter people out in this way. And it seems like a lot of us, like also as I think of maybe in recent years, practices around dating apps have changed. People are finding it less, you know, I don't know, maybe they're finding it a little bit soul sucking or less effective. So there's a way in which I think people would broadly recognize that this is that ticking all the boxes doesn't necessarily yield love, right? We can have our kind of ideas of like what the desirable qualities are. And yet I think these practices are really recalcitrant, right? That we still kind of have these ways of enumerating desirable qualities, including when we're describing why we like someone, which is an example that you give, right? Like, oh, he's smart, funny, and nice or whatever, right? Like, and so there's something really reductive about that. But we have these practices of enumerating desirable qualities as well as like, either to kind of imagine how we want someone to be or just in describing them, as if we're kind of shopping for a product or describing a product. So one question for you is like, well, generally like, yeah, what is Fanny's take on this? But also, why are they so recalcitrant, these practices? But also, yeah, would you describe these practices as a kind of characterizing a misguided search for love? Is it something else altogether? Like, do we just say, actually, this is the project of finding a partner? And in that sense, maybe some people are going to treat it in a very kind of market-driven way, and maybe there's room for that, or ways of doing that ethically, but that's like different from the project of finding ourselves in love. And finally, relatedly, like, what is the relationship between those kinds of practices of enumeration and storytelling? Storytelling is something that you bring up as something that lovers do. And I sometimes worry that even if individuals engage in more storytelling, that can also kind of be a attempt to short circuit intimacy or building knowledge of a beloved over time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but so I guess the simple answer is that I think it depends a lot on what you think you're doing when you enumerate those qualities. So let's just stick with the kind of core, what I take to be the core of the question you're asking, which is like, what are we doing when we say, I want someone who is, thank you, Ferris Lupino, for tall, dark, and handsome. I want someone who's tall, dark, and handsome. I will go out and try to find them. Or in the activity of saying to a friend who's wishing for love, or to take it out of romantic love, thinking about who they hope their child will become, or who they want to find as friends in a new city or something like that. These other kinds of examples I think can be helpful too. So imagine we're having that conversation. You've moved to a new city and we're talking about like, how do you want to build a community? Who are you trying to find? I don't think we think of that as the same activity as listing the qualities I desire in a romantic partner, but I think I want us to think of them as actually more similar, in part because I'm interested in what's happening in the conversation that you and I would have about that. And if you're doing it on your own, if we're thinking about our own thinking with this, we could imagine it as also the relationship I have to myself. So there is a dialogical dimension there too. And I think we're doing a lot of different things in enumerating those kinds of qualities. And this is all perspective. I'll talk about let me tell you about the new person I met in just a second. But in the prospective version, if you and I were doing that, I think we would be communicating, for example, what we think of each other, what kind of relationship we have. If we're talking as friends, so you might be saying, well, I know you to be someone who cares about X. That's a really important activity of friendship is that narration of the other. I take this mostly from a discussion with Adriana Cabrera's work on narrating friends and loved ones. And I really appreciate her descriptions of this, that sometimes when we're doing this kind of conversation, when we're having conversations like this, what we're doing is telling each other who we see the other to be. And that's part of what it feels like sometimes to be loved by the other, or to feel like I have any kind of relationship with you. You can test it in the other direction if you say like, oh, Fannie, I know you to be someone who just like loves just a crude and boring and dull person, and look at your last two boyfriends and like I'll look out for one of those for you. I would feel sort of dramatically unloved by you if you were to say things like that. At least as a person who does not enjoy crude and boring people. But anyway, there are all sorts of things to say in those terms, but I think there is this kind of narration of the self or narration of the other that's happening in that enumeration, that might have less to do with what you're actually going out to look for. That's a place where I think like the dating app stuff kind of fails, and we all have a sense of that, or at least we, in the sense of like there are 1,000 movies made about this where like you meet the person who isn't the right person for you. That's not a very good guide to these things, but anyway, I'll take it as an example for the moment, to say that the idea that we fall in love with the unexpected person is maybe a way of suggesting that those things don't necessarily need to add up to who we find ourselves loving. In terms of the retrospective, that most people know, but in terms of the retrospective, we're interested in talking about the people we love to other people or to ourselves or to them. And that part I would rely on this kind of narration of the other to describe. I think we're doing a lot when we describe the people we love. We're communicating to other people or to ourselves what we value. We're communicating things about the person that we think the other person might value. So the example I use with students often is like, you might have a different description of your boyfriend or girlfriend to your friends than you do to your parents. And that's because you're communicating in part what you take the audience to share with you in value. And that can have a really complex relational structure. I might also be communicating, like if I'm talking to my parents about someone, the student is talking to their parents about someone they've just met, and are romantically interested in, or a friend, they might also be communicating like, this is the thing that I know my parents value about me based on this past experience, or this is something I know that these people who love me want for me. I mean, that at that level is a sort of multiple practices back and forth of valuing things in the other and narrating the other, all of which can be encoded there. The version of this that I find sort of fundamentally uninteresting is the idea that any of this is what would be the complete answer to why I love somebody. And it's amazing to me how often that is sort of how philosophers try to approach. And I mean, I spent a while doing this too, and then kind of realized that you could just forego this description and maybe we'd be better off. But that there are so many philosophical accounts of our evaluation of others that are seeking some kind of evaluation that would be the answer to why I love the person, instead of thinking about it as a sort of practice of communication. And I think on the whole, the people who write those accounts have done the best work at figuring out why they don't work. So some of the book is about showing why they don't work, but I'm mostly quoting other people. Like, very few philosophers think that it's easy to come up with an evaluation that answers the question of why I love the person. Even Plato doesn't think that when he's talking about Eros, and he mostly gives a view of Eros that looks a lot like that. But insofar as we spend a lot of time giving these evaluations, giving these accounts of the people we love, I think it's useful to think of them as you say, as storytelling and as a practice of connection to the person we're talking to, and also expression of our values as we're doing that. And I don't mean values in a like American family values sense, but what are the goods that we value in people? What are the goods that we hold dear?
Mm-hmm. Mhm. Okay, I'm thinking where I want to go next, but there's something, well, maybe
Mhm.
since you kind of ended on this note about accounting for our love, I'm gonna jump ahead to the last chapter
Mhm.
of your book where you start to think about that kind of like so one major pressure of time I started also by asking about the ways we experience kind of pressures in time with regards to love, but one of the main one that you're addressing in the fourth chapter is around illness and dying, right? So when a beloved falls ill and perhaps especially terminally ill, that suddenly the kind of story that you've been telling about not knowing like the not knowing to what to not knowing or not being able to expect exactly what time together will bring, that changes in the sense that one can expect suffering between um, the present time and the time of death, which is like perhaps imminent.
Yeah.
So you talk about two examples. One, a series of paintings by the Swedish painter Hodler, and then second, the relationship between Lewis and Pryor in Tony Kushner's play Angels in America. And one of the things, so I perhaps if we have time, we can talk about the Hodler, but I would like to talk about Angels in America in part because you describe. Well, I think it's an ethically interesting and a difficult case, right? Where you describe how Lewis is kind of already falling out of love with Pryor, is kind of ready to leave Pryor, and then Pryor is diagnosed with AIDS and is having the kind of worst symptoms that's starting to set in at the beginning of the play. And so there's also this question around like, do I have to stay while my partner is sick? Um, Even though I was just about ready to leave, or in some sense the kind of love had ended because Lewis was no longer really interested in spending time with Pryor. But the, to connect it back to where you just ended, there's also it seems like Lewis is trying to account for the end of his love
Mhm.
in this play as well, and make and kind of figure out what does that have to do with what he's should be doing now in his relationship to Pryor.
Mhm.
So that's maybe to name one example of some of the problems that arise in Angels of America. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the other reasons that drew you to this example, and kind of what you're making sense of through your engagement with Angels of America.
Yeah, thanks. So for those who don't know the play super well, Isabel just described it, but I'll add a couple things to the description. This is a relationship between two men in the 80s, and one of them is the height of the AIDS epidemic in New York, and one of them is diagnosed with AIDS. And the thing I want to add to your description is that it's not clear. Sorry, one is diagnosed with AIDS. One is trying to figure out what his obligations are and whether he still loves the one who's diagnosed. So Lewis is the uncertain one. Pryor is the sick one. Those are obviously not the same category. And I think Tony Kushner makes a lot out of the fact that if you sort of think of what their two stable identities, one is about a kind of uncertainty in his desires and obligations and understanding of the relationship between desire and obligation. And one of them has a stable identity that is defined by physicality. And so, like, his own wishes and desires, as well as his sense of right and wrong or his ethics and obligations. Have a very different status in the play. They're very present, but they don't define the character in quite the same way, which I think is a very interesting way of writing these two characters that Kushner's doing here. So part of what drew me to the example is that I think Lewis is a great literary example of someone who is actually uncertain about love, who like actually has questions about love. And he asks them constantly in the play. A huge part of his character is like the thing that it sounds like philosophers writing about love are always answering. And actually, like, for the most part, there aren't a lot of examples of people who are like, I don't know, is this really what love is? Could I possibly love somebody in this way? And there he is, just like explaining them, saying them out loud, saying them in so many words, kind of constantly throughout this whole spectacular epic play. And so part of what draws me to him is that, like, I think it's interesting to see this very explicit ethical discourse in this in this play, and a very explicit engagement with what use ethical discourse is in love. And that's really where my argument about it hinges, is that part of where the play gets to with him, and it does it a little bit all the way through, but really this is like where the character develops, or where the opinion of the play kind of develops on the character, that we hear partly articulated by Prior, partly articulated by their friend and Prior's nurse Felice, and some other sources, is that the kind of question that Lewis is asking, which is, do I need to stick around and care for this person when I don't love them anymore? Is a question that is never going to be resolved in philosophical terms that will be satisfying to the people involved. So it might be the case that he should stick around and care. It might be based on a sort of philosophical reasoning. It might be the case that he doesn't owe Prior any of those things, so long as Prior's care is sort of provided for. He knows he's not abandoning him to great suffering or something like that. But the view that I think the play ends up taking, which is expressed by Prior and Belize particularly, is that that kind of doesn't matter to Prior, because what matters is that this person Prior loves doesn't love him anymore, and so there's going to be something heartbreaking. There is a heartbreak happening, and providing for his care, sort of fulfilling the desire, is just not the story that matters the most to Prior. And what I love about that as an example is that I think it's an important way of saying the questions about whether, whether care requires love, or whether love demands that you care for the other person or something like that, the understanding of failures in both directions, the entanglement of love and care in those ways. I think it's important to remember who the audience is for any of the philosophical questions you might be asking. And one of the things that I think the play does is say, the philosophical question just doesn't matter to this audience, and I find that really interesting. So part of what I try to argue is that this is actually a way of starting to, or a good example of why we should think about love and care as actually more separate than we often do, et cetera, et cetera. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. There are sort of technical dimensions to that, but I hope the example kind of stands for this point about audience that is really of a piece with the point I was trying to make earlier, talking about earlier, with the communicative practice of enumerating qualities. That these are about practices of that have sort of speaking practices that have speakers and listeners, and about building relationships through that communication, and about the way that the practice of describing what we're doing to each other, and the building these kinds of relationships, and thinking about relying on each other and holding each other to account when we fail, and all of that, that those are things that have very specific audiences, sort of agents and audiences, and they're about those agents and how they relate to each other. They're not as much about a sort of abstract definition of what love is and what it would require. And the thing that Lewis wants is an abstract definition that will maybe get him off the hook, or maybe let him feel really, really bad about himself, but in grand terms. I think that's actually probably really what he wants in the way that Kushner describes him. He wants to be condemned, like, by the universe and by the force of thought itself. And what he can't deal with is the fact that he's not going to be condemned by the force of reason. He's going to be condemned by this person sitting in front of him. And actually, that's a lot worse. And so I think it sort of pulls us back to the relational in that way that that I find really compelling.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have a bunch more questions, but I'm seeing that we have a good handful of wonderful questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to defer to those, and Fanny, you and I will just have to talk some other time about all the other things I want to ask you about. So first, Wayne from Dallas, Texas, is asking, how does one discern between selfish attachment and selfless love?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there are ways to. I guess the first thing I would say, or the first thing I'm interested in this kind of question, is that probably we're going to get it wrong sometimes. So the discernment is something that needs to be sort of ongoing and skeptical of the self. The basic way I would think about distinguishing between those, there's a lot of good work on this, and there are a lot of theories of it, but that are interesting. But I think the basic way that I think about it in this project, at least, is to say that sort of selfish attachment is about a kind of project of the self that is unwilling to allow other people to determine who you are, what your life is like. So how your time proceeds is the language I would use in the book. Whereas the desire is not exactly, sorry, the terms given were selfish attachment and selfless desire.
Selfless love.
Selfless love. So selfless love, I don't think, I don't really describe love in those terms because I'm not sure how to think about it without the self. I know there are good reasons to talk about it that way, but I'm not always so confident in those. I have other disagreements with them, but the kind of selfless love that I take that sometimes to refer to, or that might be what the asker is thinking about, is like, when is it about you and when is it about somebody else? And I don't actually think we can make that distinction very well in the abstract. I think we make it more in practice when we're thinking about things like, when am I setting aside one vision of what I hoped my future would be like in favor of, or in order to allow for, the things that this person is going to bring to my life or make different about the way I spend my time. And that's a place where it gets tested, basically. And I don't think you necessarily find out that you were always a selfish lover or a selfish attacher on the basis of that testing and coming out in the other direction. But I think that defining that in the abstract is very difficult, and is difficult partly because it tends to either pull the lover out of the equation of what it means to want time with the beloved. It sort of makes them no longer a participant in that time. Or it kind of overreads them into it, where it's like entirely about what people, I just use this language, but I usually hate this language of like what people bring to my life, or how you're a part of this thing that I'm the main character in. And I think that it's more interesting when we think about it in the pragmatic sense of like, where do these things get tested?
Awesome. Thank you.
I would love to talk more about that but anyway.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question from an anonymous attendee who says, thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that love as a desire is something that happens to you rather than it being voluntary. The idea that you can't help who you love, right? And that's what you mentioned, Frankfurt's kind of second order, right? You might love someone and feel like you don't want, you wish you didn't, but that's because it's out of your control. It's not voluntary. Okay, so the question asker is saying, and yet when we talk about self-love, this is something that appears to be a conscious, deliberate act of trying to love ourselves until we potentially do. How would you compare this kind of worked at love that is directed towards ourselves compared to the love we feel towards others, which seems to be out of our control? And would this process of gradually increasing our love towards ourselves contradict other notions of a more set in place kind of love we have for others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, let me go with the beginning, the first part first. I think that actually the way the questioner describes self-love is part of all of our forms of love. That sometimes our forms of love are not voluntary, but in my description of them, this Harry Frankfurt sense a little bit, I'm not on board with everything he's saying, but I'm not describing love as voluntary, but it can be something we work at until it happens in any case. So I was talking earlier about the inconvenience, say, of falling out of love with someone you've organized your life around. And that might be something that you work on. I've fallen out of love with my husband, but I don't really want my life to change. So maybe I can, try to make this happen. Try to make myself fall back in love with him. And part of what I want to say about it, what I do argue about that not being under my control, is that I might not be successful. But I do think that we can leverage our practices and our other loves and cares against our will, to put it all in very Frankfurt terms, to try to give us the best shot of finding ourselves back in that position. I think it's a pretty reasonable objection to that kind of very Frankfurt account, that at that point, what is the difference between saying that something is involuntary, but I can work really hard at it, and maybe I'll find myself there, and saying that it is voluntary because I can work at it and get there. And I think the question kind of gets to that skepticism about how significant that difference really is. And so I'll tell you the two places where that difference matters to me, or that I think that difference can really matter. And one is that one of the things that led me to write this book was working with domestic violence victims as a counselor. And a thing that comes up a lot in counseling victims of domestic violence, and the people I worked with were people who were suffering from pretty significant forms of physical violence. I worked in hospitals, so people who had come to hospitals for treatment because of physical abuse, which is a relatively extreme form. And so many of the people that I worked with said that they still loved the person and that they didn't know what to do with that. And so that's a place where I think the involuntariness of love is useful. That these are the people I was working with are people who are feeling themselves to have little control over whether they still love somebody, even when they feel an enormous amount of good reasons and even urgency in no longer loving them. So that's one direction of the kind of involuntary that I find important. I think it's important to be able to say your love for that person is just a thing that you're experiencing, and is a thing that you're experiencing that's important, instead of saying like, well, you shouldn't love that person because of all of this kind of stuff, which is often what victims might be saying to themselves. The other place where I think the involuntary is important is in falling out of love with people. I know this is the focus of so much of your work as well, but that falling out of love with people, like the sense in which you can try really hard and you still might not love them, even when it's really inconvenient. I'm really interested in that fact. That seems to be a fact of human existence. This is where the Angels American example is great too. That like, so suppose Lewis really doesn't love Pryor. He can't make himself love Pryor, even if he were to act in all the ways that might instill it. That is just a different, that will turn into a human tragedy that I think is worth describing on those terms, as opposed to describing on the terms of Lewis failed to love in a certain kind of way because he wasn't able to make himself love. I think he fails to love in certain kinds of ways, but not because he can't make himself love, more because of the way that he describes his lack of love. But anyway, that's a longer story. So that's all I'll say. That difference between the voluntary and involuntary, I think, is really important in certain moments to be able to name, because, or it's important to be able to talk about the involuntariness of loving or not loving. Even if I think there's a lot you can do to try to force yourself to do it. And self-love is also a great example. Sorry, I'll finish this answer real quick. But self-love, I think it's really important to be able to say, like, we can work really hard at self-love, and sometimes it doesn't work. And many of us struggle to love ourselves, and that struggle is not a failure to have accomplished the kinds of things that you can do to encourage self-love. It also is sort of the lack of will that just sometimes doesn't emerge, even when you have organized your life in ways that practice self-love or practice things that might encourage self-love. And so, if anything, there's an importance to naming that isn't under people's control totally, even if you can do a lot to try to help them.
Thanks for that, Fanny. Okay, I'm going to throw in two questions,
Mhm.
if that's okay. And one, because I think it's maybe an extension of what you were just saying about self-love.
Mhm.
If I had to guess what I think your views are on this. So, one of our viewers is asking, do you think that love is also culture-based? Different cultures may have different conceptions. And so is there a way to kind of they maybe come together philosophically. But I was thinking about that in part because of cultural parts of self love, or how it may or may not be easier for some people to love themselves based on the culture that they're in. And then
Mhm.
the second question comes from Tony Alimi, who
Mhm.
thanks you for this conversation and is asking if there's something particular to the Christian tradition or Christian thought that's made it an especially rich resource for you. Um, Put more reductively, why Christianity as opposed to another tradition. Um, One surprising thing about your framing is that Christian love has often been taken to be aiming towards and normed by love of an unchanging God. How does that fit in with your focus on love's temporality?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Thank you both for those questions. So there's a chapter for you, Tony, about this problem exactly, but actually the other direction. So maybe it's not doing what you want it to do. But to answer the first question briefly, I think that there's a lot of cultural dependence of how we relate to each other, and that's both in terms of how we describe our relationships to each other. And also in terms of the norms that guide our relationships, which is, in my account, the norms by which I would be held to account by the people around me. So to go back to the Angels in America example, there are different norms um, that are used to hold Lewis and Pryor to account, even than their immediate surroundings. A lot of the play is about what it's like to be gay in New York in 1980 and in the 1980s, and the way that the condemnation of gay love is part and not part of the kinds of condemnations within the relationship between Lewis and Pryor. And so that's a really good example of how there are all of these norms, both within the relationship, within the close community around the relationship, and then beyond it, that Lewis and Pryor are contending with. But I really want to emphasize that I see that kind of structure, normative structure, as being a matter of the social practices that surround the experiences the lovers are having, not part of the inherent definition of love as many philosophers want to talk about it. And so I think, like, one of the things that I'm interested in is how often this is part of why I distance also from thinking about the taxonomies of love. That I think there are, as I said at the outset, a lot of good reasons to be worried about the norms and to want to describe thickly within the communities of which you're a part, um, the kinds of norms that govern within my culture the relationship between parents and children, so that my parents can tell me when I'm being a bad child and I can tell my children when they're being bad children, and maybe vice versa, but et cetera, et cetera. But that I think it's important to say that those are features less of how a sense of a sort of philosophical, abstract understanding of love, and much more features of how we are able to structure our normative lives. And the reason I'm struggling to articulate this is that a big part of the book is to say that these are things that we need ethics for, not that we need a definition of love for. And so we need a definition of good parent-child relationships. We don't need a definition in that sense of good parent-child love. And I actually want to extract love from so many of those discussions, to some extent, even if it is a word that people use, because of the involuntariness that I was talking about just a minute ago. That if love is something I can't exactly motivate successfully unto myself just out of intention, then it's going to be difficult to have it be, for instance, required that I love my parents within my cultural community. It might be required that I treat my parents in certain ways within my cultural community. And I think that's something that we can successfully set up, ethically practice, and call each other to account for in ways that are better than if we said, like, you have to feel a certain kind of way. And that actually gets to Tony's question, though, maybe sort of orthogonally, to say that part of what I'm interested in the reason why Christianity, I mean, the basic autobiographical reason is that I grew up in the United States, and my neighbors are Christians, and for the most part, and as people who talk about the love of, as a neighbor of Christians who talk about the love of neighbor, I'm interested in what they mean by that. So there's a kind of basic, like contextual autobiographical claim about that I'm interested in Christianity for those kinds of reasons. I'm educated in the West. Like, these are the traditions that I received in my education and formation. But much more thickly, there's something really interesting to me in many discussions of Christian thought, of Christian ethics, especially in exactly this point about motivation. So what does it mean to have the duty to love when part of what's important is that you're not loving exclusively out of duty, but like actually caring for the other? This is absorbs so much of Christian ethics, and with varying answers. The version of it that I pick up in this book sort of begins to some extent with Kierkegaard, and then really with Anders Nygren, and thinking about a certain strand of Lutheran Protestant Christian ethics that continues in Anglo-American philosophy through people like Reinhold Niebuhr and Jean Outke and Timothy Jackson. That's the core contemporary example. But in all of those contexts, exactly to your point, part of what I find really, really fascinating about the sort of the context, the Christian context for thinking about love, is that you have both an unchanging, there are various dimensions of unchanging divine, and a vulnerable changing divine. You don't, I'm Jewish, you don't get that in Judaism because there's no incarnation, so it's a really different structure. But the sense of the changeableness of the divine, and also the changing of human beings who are loved by the divine, or who are being loved as neighbors by Christians, according to the command to love your neighbor, that intrusion of vulnerability, I think, is into understandings of divine love is really fruitful, and is really interesting for thinking about what it's like to love as a human being. The fact that God incarnates God's self as a vulnerable being says a lot, can teach a lot about what that love means. In the other direction, and this is the core critique of the chapter that's about these literatures, I think that, spurred largely by Anders Nygren's understanding, that there are some or the ones that I'm talking about, some of the accounts that I'm talking about are very interested in describing divine love as something that is so unchanging that it actually is really non-responsive to the beloved. And that I'm very critical of. I think that it comes not out of sort of any problem with modeling human love on divine love, but with a mistake in Nygren's theology. He's so worried about implying that human beings might merit God's love, that he renders divine love invulnerable to human doing, that there's nothing we can do that would affect God's love for us, good or bad. And if you take that as a model of what the duty to love looks like, I think you get this sort of radically invulnerable lover, who then kind of exudes love, but as a project of the self, even for God. And the various efforts to kind of reformulate that duty from problems in Nygren's understanding, I am arguing, I think, really are based on, or don't quite solve for, the root problem, which is that God is invulnerable to humans, to the beloved, and that invulnerability makes it no longer a relationship. So Nygren can't really describe it as relational in that way. So all of this to say, I mean, I think the fact that you can even, that's a sort of scattered answer, but the fact that you can have all of these conversations in Christian thought, you can certainly have them in other traditions, but I find the versions of them in Christianity really interesting. And I think, well, there's also just the the basic formative thing that the concepts I use are largely formed in a Christian society. So I want to find out where they come from and how they work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Fanny. I think that's a great note to kind of wrap up on. I'm sorry to say that it's time for us to end our session. We have some really great questions in the chat. I wanted to thank all of our viewers for engaging so thoughtfully. Thank you, Fanny, for spending the time with us today. It was really fabulous to get to talk. And thanks again to everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone, and thanks to the journal. I really am grateful to get to have this conversation.